some of this could be habituated. I'm not sure if that's English, but becomes like a part of the field itself, and you must just tag along without reflecting too much about it. And that if there's some other ideas, perspectives being presented, at least you have to figure out yourself if this is what you actually believe in. You become better by being criticized. And if no one is criticizing you, you lose that opportunity to actually improve.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Sustainability science, which includes conservation biology and various other environmental studies, is not a hard science like physics or mathematics. Nevertheless, one might expect it to be reasonably independent of political affiliation. But is this the case? If not, what's the problem with leaning too far in one political direction, especially if that direction is left and generally considered to be pro-environment? If it is a problem, what can we do about it? Örjan Bodin is a sustainability scientist at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, who has thought a lot about this topic and published a recent paper on it. Örjan is quick to point out that he's not formally studied political polarization, but with decades of research experience in sustainability science, he provides some compelling reasons why we should pay attention to this overlooked but potentially highly consequential issue. I began by asking Örjan what distinguishes sustainability science from other disciplines, especially in terms of advocacy for societal change.
I kind of lean on many of these different definitions of what is sustainability science, and there are a few, but if you kind of try to aggregate them and find a common, the common denominator in many of these definitions, it's basically, first of all, it's about understanding the world and so on. That's more like a traditional discipline. Part of the definition is that sustainability science should also try to do more than just understand, to help societies in various ways to do better in one way or another. So I think that is the distinguishing characteristics of sustainability science, that in many of these different definitions, there's an assumption that we should do more than just observe the world. We should also try to engage with the world to make it a better place. I'm not saying that sustainability science is the only research field that is focusing on that, but I still think it's something that makes it a bit different from, for example, like physics or chemistry or political science, even though political science might also be seen as where you also want to have ingredients where you have an intention to at least reach out and maybe then affect the world outside academia. So I think that since we are facing so many problems in the world right now that has to do with sustainability, what we do here, or try to do, is important, and there are so much things that in the world which are not going in the right direction, which mean that this is not like a theoretical exercise on we should do this and that and so on. It is kind of life-threatening to some extent, but that sense of importance and urgency, I think, also can conflict a little bit with the scientific process, which is based on incremental knowledge building and testing new ideas and being quite certain about this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, in terms of this is a correct interpretation of reality and this is an incorrect interpretation of reality. So I think that kind of sense of urgency and importance can sometimes be in conflict with the more traditional scientific approach, which creates some tension. And that's also why I think it's a bit hard to navigate in this landscape. Because I don't think it's the right thing to say, let's observe the world and don't try to reach out. I don't think that's the best way to do this. But also when you reach out and try to kind of change the world, or at least have some impact beyond academia, and you reach into different political questions and domains which are highly contested. And then it's really hard to do that while remaining being scientific, have some sense of objectivity and so on. And many of these questions are highly politicized. So it's difficult to navigate that. And that's one of the reasons why first of all, I think this topic is super important, and also where we need to maybe nuance things a little bit, or at least discuss these issues a bit more than what I perceive that we do.
Your article, right in the title, talks about or asks the question whether sustainability science is leaning too far left. I think it would be a good idea to start with a definition of left and right. So I think this does differ from place to place around the world. A lot of the left-right distinction is based on the US model, I guess. But this is a global phenomenon that you're talking about. So how would you define left-leaning and right-leaning research in sustainability science? And maybe a couple of examples would help to illustrate as well.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, I think it's hard to say because it differs between contact countries and also through time, I guess. So I try in this article to focus more on the more economic aspects of right versus left. And then, in very simple terms would be like if you're more left-leaning, you'll be more in favor of regulation and the government in various ways, local, national, global, that are kind of regulate stuff more, control things, maybe also take part of the distribution of resources and so on. Whereas the more right-leaning way of doing things would be to have more, believe more to the market, up to individuals, actors, organizations to look for the best product and don't interfere too much with the production system and so on. It's a very basic idea about left and right. But of course, as you say, these days there is more to that. And that makes it also quite difficult to navigate this landscape because, for example, like conservative is nowadays seen as right. But I'm not sure if that's the right label on conservative because they don't necessarily favor market mechanisms that much, probably more than if you are very much to the left, though, but it's not necessarily the same thing. And you can have these other aspects that have been put into the left-right dimension, and there are more dimensions. For example, this Galtan thing, I'm not sure if it's even used anymore, but that was more globalized, or like if you have favor of globalization to simplify things versus more nationalistic, more kind of local based or something like that. I'm not even sure if that's the best way to describe it. It's just an example of different dimensions in the political debate, which are to some extent left-right, but there are also different dimensions. In this paper, I chose to focus on the more economic side of it because these other dimensions, I think it's really hard to navigate them, and it's maybe more tricky in terms of triggering bad emotions, more or less.
So in the paper, you make this claim that sustainability science is leaning too far left. But how do you gauge that? So in economic terms, as you've just mentioned, that's your sort of measure. But how do you gauge whether sustainability science is leaning too far left? And perhaps you can also say whether that's changed. Is that a new thing entirely, or is it something that's always been that way?
When I wrote this paper, I had to look up this a little bit, and it varies between different contexts. So even though I would say, at least where I'm from, and also if you look at the US, for example, I think the left have been more associated with more environmental concern than the right. But it has also changed over time a little bit. And again, like in different places, it could be like a different alignment of the left-right versus being more or less concerned about the environment. But okay, some examples, I think, or just first of all, I would say that I haven't done any quantitative estimate of this. This is more like based on my personal observation, but I've been doing this for 20 years. So I've at least seen some developments. And I think in recent years, it has come more to the left, I would say, in terms of arguing for the need for regulations, for controlling the market, and sometimes even seeing the market as an enemy. It's not that uncommon that you see in papers that, due to capitalism, we have climate change. And maybe that's the case, but I think it's still a little bit too simplified because capitalism includes many different things like free market and, private ownership and all that stuff. And I think it's a little bit too blunt, maybe just to bundle everything together and say that's the reason for many of these problems that we see today. And maybe it is, but you rarely don't see many counter arguments, at least not in academic literature. So I'm not trying to say what is right and wrong here. It's more like I want to see that plurality of perspectives. And I would say, in particular in recent years, it has been much more left-leaning arguments in papers, and in particular when I go to conferences and workshops, that seems to be like it's, if someone says something that I would associate with being more on the left side, that's kind of total mainstream. But if someone says like maybe we should actually consider some market mechanism in this, and maybe there are some utility in using market mechanisms for trying to deal with some environmental problems, it's very rare that they actually hear that. And if you hear it, often people think that that's not a good idea.
It's very closely related, it seems, to what's going on in the general socio-political discourse that's going on in the world at the moment. Environment has become very much a part of that, but that discourse has become, I think, very polarized, again, based mostly on the US model, but I think that's kind of spread worldwide. But there does seem to be kind of a global sense that the more left-leaning way of seeing things is really more the mainstream now. And mainstream just by definition, has a quality to it, a sort of an unquestionable quality. There's a conflict there between what the way that science should work and the way that these discourses work, whether it's leaning right or left.
Yeah. Many of these things are not like what is objectively right and wrong. It's more like questions. There should be more curiosity around these different approaches to deal with problems. But if for some reason the mainstream idea is that this is typically what we need to do in terms of favoring something that is more left or right leaning, we kind of lose some of that ability. And also, again, there's a little bit like a tension between the more scientific approach to sustainability science and that other kind of making some change in the world. Again, coming back to this urgency. So in science, things should take time. We should investigate, we should validate, we should do a lot of things before we move on and say this is something that we are fairly certain on. But of course, that process doesn't really go that super well with the sense of urgency that we have today. There is a tension there, and I think that's also kind of contribute that we might kind of maybe step over some steps here in the process. We don't necessarily find the time and energy to investigate these fundamental assumptions, which are still assumptions, and then we kind of move on instead of spending some time on questioning them and investigating them. That's one of them, maybe one of the reasons, but also one of the interesting and problematic tensions here between figuring things out in a more rigorous way versus trying to do something with them situation that is not particularly favorable.
I'm glad that you reiterated that point of urgency, because I don't think I completely grasped it when I read through the paper, even though I've been through it a few times. But, it puts me in mind of the argument that in situations where there's a national or international emergency of some kind, those are the situations in which government can kind of, put the rule book aside and take fairly drastic measures, right? And it's because of the dire and imminent threat of the situation. And I think it's probably that same psychology really that's governing things at the moment. I was wondering though, I still am not completely sure why this is happening now. Why the polarization or the lean to the left in sustainability science in particular is happening right now, because there was an urgency 10 years ago and there was an urgency 20 years ago. Do you have any thoughts about that? You don't address that specifically in the article, but just curious to know if you have any particular thoughts about that.
Well, of course, like this is some kind of, it builds up over time. So if it was urgent 10 years ago, it's even more urgent today, given that the trajectory is going in the same direction. But also, I think that, on the political agenda, this is much higher now. So the urgency might, in some way, be the same, but suddenly there's an opportunity to, or there's more of a political opportunity to do something about these problems. So it's a window of opportunity in that sense, because now it is high on the agenda. Now we can do something, but we need to do it now. So that could be part of that urgency sense. So, but I think it's an excellent question, because as you say, like many of these fundamental problems, they have been around for a very long time. We should have addressed them earlier, definitely. Given these sustainability problems that we have today and how high they are on the agenda, it also means that if you have some other interests, you might not be super concerned about, let's say, environmental sustainability, but other things. And if you can associate yourself with that sustainability agenda, you get some leverage. And I actually think I mentioned that in the paper, and that's a danger I can see, because if sustainability becomes like part of a package deal, which is more about many other things, for example, it can be drowned in a way, but it can also more easily be associated with a particular side in a political debate. And that, which means that environmental issues could then be seen as an argument that is very closely associated with a political enemy, and therefore you don't like it. I think like these environmental problems, they are universal in a sense. So it's like the problem are there. Then we can have very different opinions about what we should do with them. But if the problem, the existence of the problem itself becomes associated with a political side in a political debate, we actually lose quite much.
Well, it seems to me that that's happened in the US already, especially since 2016. Every issue is divided along a left-right line or a Republican-Democrat line. So I worry that they've gone very far down that road there, and it's going to take some effort to get back again.
Mm-hmm. In a way, it is a bit of a scary example of what goes on in the US, even though I can only watch that from the outside. But I think, as you say here, it's like, I think climate change, for example, has become a package deal there on the left side or the Democratic Party's side. So nowadays, and I know that, for example, there was the study that I was reading a while ago, and they were investigating, I think it was something with water governance, and they want to investigate what different countries thought about it and how they planned around that. They couldn't use climate change in the survey because that triggered that kind of political instinct, but they could use things like increased droughts and increased flooding and so on. That was no problem at all. But the phrase climate change triggered so much political instinct and reaction, so people couldn't actually relate to that in a more kind of objective way. So, which I also think could be misleading in terms of, because now it's in a very simplified way, people might think that if you're a Republican in the US, you don't believe in climate change. To some extent, that is definitely correct, but maybe it's not as bad as it looks like, because the phrase climate change is triggering political behavior. So that if you kind of rephrase that, people might still be concerned about climate change, but they don't call it climate change, because then they associate themselves with the other side of the political debate. Was just another example of what could happen if it becomes like part of a package deal in politics. And then, again, I think that could be detrimental for the bigger question of environmental sustainability, or actually sustainability in general.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a branding issue almost.
Yeah.
In your article, you don't mention the term viewpoint diversity, but it seems to me like you are arguing for the fact that viewpoint diversity is being neglected in sustainability science. Why do you think that's the case?
Thinking more in terms of left than right becomes mainstream, then you lose some diversity, more or less by definition. And I'm not saying that if you have different opinions of being suppressed or cancelled, it could actually happen in some places though. But it's just like there's a void in terms of people that express ideas or have some concerns, whatever, or at least have an interest in investigating, let's say, potential solutions that might be leaning more towards the right. There's kind of not so many people there, I would say. There are people there, so it's not like total void though, but I would say, at least when it comes to the more kind of public discussions and so on, it's much more, I would say, to the left. So, and I think we miss that, not necessarily because we suppress them, because they're simply not there to the same extent that they are there when it comes to the more left-leaning orientation. I think it's not that good for a scientific process because you become better by being criticized. And if no one is criticizing you, you lose that opportunity to actually improve.
Are there any particular problems with leaning too far left, or is it more just a case of leaning too far either way is an issue?
I think the lack of viewpoint diversity is the problem here. I might have an opinion which might be more left or right, but this is more like in the scientific domain, in the scientific process, we should have that diversity in terms of research approaches and viewpoints and so on. So I guess so that's one of the problems, that we might lose out or we might miss some of the potential solutions, I think. And I mentioned that in the paper, that there might be some innovative solutions that we can somehow, that might be never realized because we don't really pick them up. There's a risk for that, at least. But also on the more political side, and I mentioned that before, I think if you want to maximize the impact in the long term, my guess is better not to associate ourselves too much with one side in some kind of left-right dimension, because they go up and down all the time. But I think these environmental or sustainability in general questions, they are more fundamental. So we might gain, I say we all the time here because I associate myself with that community, but I think we could gain in the short term by aligning or associate us with the political side, but in the long term, we might actually lose out on that. But I also want to make clear that it doesn't mean that we should be all over the place, but trying to be as neutral or objective as possible, even if it can be really tricky in a political debate, like for example in the US, where there seems to be so many emotions about the other side. And it's really hard to stand there and say, I don't want to take sides. So I can also appreciate and acknowledge the difficulties that I guess many US academics have these times. But still, this is about navigating this.
Do you think that maybe one of the big challenges, going back to what we were saying about the left being the mainstream now, more or less, it seems like part of the problem may be that sustainability scientists are just using the rhetoric that exists in the literature. For example, saying something negative about neoliberalism or capitalism or something like that. It's kind of in the water that they're swimming in already. It's not like they're trying to push an idea, but rather that they might not even realize that they're doing it. Do you think that's part of the problem? Do you think that a lot of sustainability science is just progressing without even giving it a second thought? Or do you think that there's more of an intentional alignment with the left or the right?
I guess both of it. It's so, let's say, it's so normal. Like if you say that this is something that's neoliberal, that's just another word for it's bad. So part of it is maybe a little bit of a sloppy use of those terms. And since there is not that much viewpoint diversity, at least in some places, not that many would react to it. And then, okay, I said that and no one said it was something strange or wrong with that. And then you can just continue doing that without necessarily reflecting too much about what it actually means. So I think that's definitely one, probably maybe even the biggest part of it. But then also I think that, this is also an opportunity for people with a certain political opinion, which could also be right or left or whatever, to use kind of the sense of urgency, the sense of importance to advocate things which are more about their own opinions or political ideologies in certain ways. And this could be one powerful vehicle to kind of drive these opinions, though. That's probably the case, at least in some cases, though. But I somehow still think that quite much of this is just like you go with the flow. You don't necessarily think that much about it.
Mm-hmm. To your point about this being a powerful vehicle. I think that's very true because although I think a lot of faith has been lost in science in recent years, there is still a lot of power in just producing a scientific paper and or being able to refer to the science. So these views do have disproportionate power just by dint of being in a scientific journal, for example. But it's interesting, just from a personal perspective, already until just the last few years in my career, or in the last few years, I started to realize that the environmental narratives that I was reciting in presentations and publications and that kind of thing, even though I still think that most of it is fairly accurate, I was more or less regurgitating it, just repeating what I had heard before without really taking the time to analyze it. And I think a lot of people have been doing that over the decades, and a lot of people continue to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the next question would be, what to do about this, assuming that sustainability science has turned left and assuming that it is a problem. What do you think are the most important things that sustainability scientists and others can and should do about that?
I definitely don't want people to change their mind about stuff. And I also had some suggestions in the paper, which are not particularly difficult, but I think could be quite valuable. One fairly easy thing to do would be to make sure that you, like if you have a workshop or conference or just some internal seminar, to make sure that you have different viewpoints being allowed to present stuff. Even if you entirely disagree with them, just bring them there and have a discussion with them. And I think that's fairly easy thing to do, and it could be done from institution group level up to university and higher conferences and so on, just to kind of expose ourselves to different viewpoints. And I think that's fairly simple and could be quite valuable. At least having some critique is useful, even if you doesn't change your mind in once, a bit. Having someone to say, what do you mean by that? What is the basis for that assumption and so on? I think that could be quite good. And in particular, if there are some people that are not so convinced in either way, or as you said before, like some of this could be habituated, I'm not sure if that's English, but becomes like a part of the field itself, and you must just tag along without reflecting too much about it. And that if there's some other ideas, perspectives being presented, at least you have to figure out yourself if this is what you actually believe in. So I think that's one fairly easy thing to do.
You just reminded me of the last 25 conferences and workshops that I went to. And something which distinguishes them is that it is so seldom that ideas are challenged at those meetings. It's again sort of back to what I was saying about regurgitating the same information. I think policymakers are actually sometimes quite good at challenging assumptions because they're the ones who are going to have to, convert science into policy. And scientists also are good at challenging on the details. But when you're talking about really fundamental underlying structures, like whether market mechanisms or regulation are better, that it doesn't really come into the discussions at all.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like when it comes to nitty-gritty stuff, that's being discussed often, in great detail, and that is the way it should be. Like, is this p-value actually correct, and did you use the right method, and so on? But when it comes, as you say, like the more overarching assumptions, they can often go unquestioned.
I was also just wondering, I'm trying to imagine the kind of person that, or the kind of, the kind of person or kind of professional who you might invite to co-author a paper or to speak at a conference or something like that. That's an interesting one. I'm just because I guess again in the economics area it might be a little bit easier because economics can be separated from politics to some extent, right? But very often, I would imagine that people are nervous about inviting someone with a very different viewpoint because they're worried that that viewpoint is going to convince people of something which they themselves are sure is wrong. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on how to deal with that. Maybe the answer is baby steps, just sort of moving slightly away from your comfort zone rather than, jumping in the deep end and inviting someone from a completely the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's not what I'm arguing for. Like taking someone with an extremely different take on everything is just like maybe too much of a challenge, and might actually not be relevant because it's just out in the blue. Like I don't want to have conspiracy theorists coming to conferences and talking about stuff I don't think that's particularly interesting. But there are a lot of different kind of nuances and viewpoints that I think should be voiced more at these conferences again. And I think I'm not sure why that is not happening that much. There could maybe be some kind of sense that maybe they're going to convince people in the wrong direction. Could be, but I somehow think that maybe they are afraid of negative reactions from a few, and that's kind of getting into my second point there, and that has to do with social media, for example, because social media is just like is the perfect medium, whatever, for extreme voices to have a say, more or less. So just like if you want to have a lot of attention on Twitter or something, I guess it's good to be extreme in one way or another. And if we listen too much on the discussions happening there or care too much about the discussions, we might lose out on that ability to kind of provide a more diverse discussion because we are afraid of reactions that could kind of take the same flavor of some of the reaction you would see on Twitter or X these days. So I think it's more like a sense of fear for upsetting someone and then not being ready to defend that choice of a speaker, for example. So if you have a pretty right-leaning speaker coming to a conference and present some stuff, there might be some people in the audience that think that was very inappropriate to have like the right-leaning person because they are by definition climate deniers. But I don't think that many people think that, but it could be a few. And then they voice their concern, and the easy way out from that problem is just not to invite them. So I think there's a certain sense of fear of negative reaction, which is partly, I think, coming from how debates are taking place on social media. I'm not even sure if I would call them debates. It's just like throwing things at each other in a not so constructive way. But I think we should be better. We shouldn't be guided too much on what is happening on social media. So that's one potential explanation. Again, I'm just guessing here, though, but I think that could probably be part of the game. And then, of course, there have been many cases also here in Sweden, but definitely in the US, I guess, where different kind of, we call it like Twitter storms, had university managers to cancel different speakers and so on because actually is often in many cases a small minority are feeling offended by having them come into campus. I think there we need to be a little bit more bold and say like they are here because they have opinions, they have viewpoints. We need to listen to them. We need to disagree with them if we like. We need to have a discussion around that.
Another thing about social media is people, and I'm sure ourselves included, are not very good at kind of comprehending the fact that this noise that's coming from a certain sector of Twitter, whether it's on the right or left, is so small. Even if we went to have a look at the stats, it would be drowned out by the emotion of the reactions of some people. But it is really a very small minority, right? So I guess that an important part of this is really just to be aware of that and to know that the most people are curious and probably want to hear about these things, especially in the scientific realm.
I agree. It's easy to become a bit misled what goes on there, but it is a small minority. So even if the number of users is not super low, like I guess 20% or something have an X account, but when it comes to people being active, it's a much lower number. Of course, some specific categories like maybe journalists and so on are quite overrepresented there. Maybe some politicians as well, though. But like if you kind of a common person, whatever that is, might not care so much about what it actually happens on X, Twitter, or some other social media.
One additional question, something that really interested me in the paper, is you mentioned, and this is not verbatim, but something to this effect. You said that rapid transformations can take unexpected and undesirable turns. So, in other words, this sort of idea of transformative change as opposed to incremental change. And so you were advocating to choose pragmatism rather than dogmatism. And I wanted to ask you what you meant by that, but also how that relates to this whole idea of sustainability science taking a left turn.
I'm not sure it's that much related to left-right necessarily. It just kind of made its way into the paper. But one of the things that I argue for in the paper is that we might spend a little bit too much time on where we want to be instead of how to get there. And I think it's easy to think about, like, we want to have a society where ecosystems are thriving, where humans are thriving. You have fairly equal distribution of resources, democratic value, and all that stuff. And I think it's quite hard to find someone to disagree with that. The problem is more like, how do we get there? And many people agree, I would say, most people, at least in sustainability science, agree that we need to change the current state of affairs quite much. Where we are right now, we are not on a sustainable trajectory. So we have to do something. It probably have to change things pretty quickly, though. But I think it's like, so my argument was like, we need to think about what to do in an incremental way, even though it has to be happening fairly soon. We should talk a little bit less about where we want to be in 50 years from now and talk more about what can we do today. In practice, in real world situation in politics, you need to make decisions about things on the table right now. And I think in those cases, it doesn't help necessarily super much to think about the utopian view 50 years from now. It's like, what can we do right now? What are the steps that could take us a bit further, taking into account realities? Like, not everyone would agree on that agenda. Okay, so what can we do instead? Or what can we do then to take us a little bit further in that direction and so on? So that's more from a political point of view. And then from a scientific point of view, it's like thinking about these different steps. A little bit less about what we need to do. We need to change the energy system. We need to change how resources are distributed and so on. But how can we kind of do that within society as it looks today? We probably want to change society, but I don't think we can change society tomorrow. We have to be a little bit more pragmatic in terms of giving some guidance for these steps and talk a little bit less about the end state. And I don't think it's necessarily so much to do with left or right. It's more about kind of long-term, short-term, and also getting into the why and how to go there. And also my statement about rapid transition or transformation is just, if things change really quick, you really don't know where you're going to go. And if you're lucky, you end up in a very nice place. But often, if you look at the history, you end up in a pretty bad place. So that's why I also think this kind of pragmatic, a little bit more stepwise approach could be like a useful way to think about change, to reduce the possibilities that you might end up in a stage which is actually much worse than today.
Right. It applies to almost anything in life. If you do something too quickly, you're very likely to screw it up, to get it wrong. So why would this be any different? You know, it seems like a pretty universal law that.
But it's also an interesting tension, which is like, this is about navigation, because we need to change things pretty quickly, but we also need to safeguard that those changes won't take us in a very bad direction. So it's definitely a tension. But I think like this, the starting point is to be aware of that tension. And then also, I think, discuss what is the role of science in that process. And you can have different viewpoints there, I think, which is totally fine. But I think part of the credibility of science is to have a little bit more like stepwise approach. You build something and maybe don't put yourself in the driving seat for change. But it's just being aware of the tension. I think that's what I was trying to say.
It's interesting because again, looking at left and right, it does seem like the right, very broadly speaking, are a little bit too, and I'm talking more of the political right here, I guess, but are a little bit too unconcerned, or they're not concerned enough about the situation, the environmental situation. Even if they do care about it, they don't care quite enough. And whereas on the left-hand side, they care a bit too much, in the sense that it's driving this urgency, which is, I think, going to cause a lot of mistakes. But also, you know, again, this is kind of a critique of the left. I think that something that I've realized, and I also consider myself someone of the left, but something that I've noticed in recent years is that it seems like the left tends not to see the entire context sometimes. So when the environment is the focus, there is an intentional exclusion of other sort of parts of the system. And I guess it goes with this whole idea of a utopian vision. You're sort of imagining this perfect future, and seeing a very clear and simple path there. And that in turn reminds me, I'm not sure if you know Thomas Sowell. He's an American economist. He's in his 90s now, but he's written about 40 books, and in one of them he talks about this concept of the constrained and the unconstrained vision of the future. But his argument is that the basic way that conservatives see things is a constrained vision, in which everything we do is going to have trade-offs. There's a better and a worse way of doing things, but there's no perfect way of doing them. And then what he sees as the left vision is the unconstrained vision, where there's this kind of utopia in the distance, and all we need to do is find the path. There's a path. We just need to find it, and the people who are getting in the way, we need to get them out of the way and just keep on going down that path. So anyway, that's just a personal ramble there, but I think that constrained and unconstrained vision does actually hit on some truths.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a slightly different dimension, maybe in terms of the economic left right though, but it's a good, and I think like ideally it would be good if we can bounce between these different ends and spend more time in the middle. I think that's my argument, because it becomes a bit kind of visionless if you only focus on what is happening right now today. But if you only focus on how you hope that things could be in the future, you lose contact with reality as it is today. So it's kind of, you don't have to be all the time in the middle though, but kind of bouncing around a little bit in that broad spectrum. I think that could be quite useful. And that's also part of my argument there. Being, let's say, pragmatic would then be more towards the conservative side, and accepting things as they are right now, and what can we do today, tomorrow, right now, that could take us in a kind of more favorable direction, but not without losing sight of where we actually want to be further ahead. Kind of move between these different time perspectives without locking yourself into one of them only. We even have a word for something like that in Swedish, which is lagom, which means not too much, not too little, just right in the middle, or just enough of both. So maybe that's what I'm arguing for here. Like give space for both these different perspectives.
Next month, I'll be speaking with Canadian conservation biologist Françoise Cardew about self-advocacy in conservation science. This topic is quite closely related to the discussion with Örjan. So if, like me, you consider these issues of politics and policy in conservation important, please make sure to join us.